Before we start this story, please support us by subscribing to this channel. Thank you.
He sent me divorce papers while abroad. The embassy interview exposed everything. The moment the embassy officer looked up from the file and asked, "Ma'am, are you aware your husband has already remarried in Canada?" The entire interview room went silent. Not completely silent at first. The printer near the back kept humming. Someone coughed softly beside the immigration counter. A baby somewhere near the waiting area started crying. But inside Amaka's head, everything else disappeared. For a second, she genuinely thought the woman had confused her file with someone else's. Because 2 weeks earlier, Chinedu had only sent divorce papers. Cold. Sudden. Emotionless. No explanation. No argument. No attempt to fix anything. Just one message attached beneath the documents. "I think it's best we both move on peacefully." After 7 years of marriage, that was all he gave her. 7 years. 7 years of midnight video calls. 7 years of sending money back and forth. 7 years of defending him to relatives who said long-distance marriages never survive. 7 years of praying together every Sunday through phone screens because he was working hard abroad for their future. And now this woman in a navy blue embassy blazer was calmly asking if she knew her husband had another wife. Amaka felt her fingers tighten around her passport. "No," she said quietly. The embassy officer stared at the computer for another few seconds before speaking again. "According to Canadian immigration records, your husband listed a different spouse during his residency renewal process 8 months ago." 8 months. The word landed slowly. Because 8 months ago, Chinedu had still been calling her every night. Still saying, "I love you." Still asking when she would finally join him overseas. That was the moment something inside Amaka shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like a crack forming inside glass. Because suddenly, all the strange things she had ignored over the past year began rearranging themselves into a terrifying pattern. The shorter phone calls. The refusal to video chat. The missing weekends. The sudden anger whenever she asked questions. The unexplained money transfers. The way he stopped talking about bringing her abroad. And worst of all, the realization that this interview was not supposed to happen. Because if the embassy had called her in today, it meant somebody, somewhere, had made a mistake. And mistakes like this do not happen inside immigration systems unless something much bigger is hiding underneath. The officer finally looked up again. "Mrs. Okafor," she said carefully, "there are several inconsistencies connected to your husband's file." Amaka swallowed slowly. Then she asked the question that would change both their lives forever. "What kind of inconsistencies?" The officer paused. And for the first time since the interview began, her expression changed from professional to concerned. 3 years earlier, before embassy interviews and immigration records and divorce papers written like business transactions, Amaka used to believe she had one of those marriages people quietly prayed for. Not perfect, but solid. The kind built slowly over time instead of through noise and performance. She met Chinedu at her cousin's engagement dinner in Enugu on a rainy evening when the power supply kept cutting every 20 minutes and everybody was sweating through their clothes pretending not to notice. He was not the loudest man in the room. In fact, she almost missed him entirely the first hour because while the other men were arguing football and politics, Chinedu sat beside the older women helping refill drinks without being asked. That was the first thing she noticed about him. Not charm. Calmness. The second thing was the way he listened when people spoke. Fully listened. As if whatever you were saying mattered. By the end of that night, he had walked her to the gate under one umbrella while the rain hit the zinc rooftops around them so loudly they had to lean close just to hear each other speak. 3 months later, they were inseparable. A year later, they got married quietly at a church in Lagos surrounded by family members who kept saying the same thing over and over. "You two fit each other." And for a long time, it genuinely felt true. When Chinedu got an opportunity to relocate to Canada through a work program, they celebrated like people who believed life was finally opening its doors for them. The plan was simple. He would settle first. Work for a year. Then file the sponsorship process so Amaka could join him permanently. At first, he called constantly. Morning calls before work. Late-night video chats after shifts. Photos inside supermarkets. Pictures standing beside snow-covered cars. Messages saying things like, "Just be patient. Everything I'm doing is for us." Amaka believed him completely. Why wouldn't she? Every sacrifice looked temporary back then. She worked extra shifts at her pharmacy job in Lagos to help support their plans. She defended him whenever relatives complained he was staying abroad too long alone. She ignored the stories people whispered about long-distance marriages because she believed trust was a decision people made daily, not a feeling that appeared only when convenient. Even when the calls slowly became shorter, she explained it away. Canada was stressful. Work was demanding. Time zones were difficult. That was what love looked like sometimes, she told herself. Understanding. Patience. Faith. But the strange thing about betrayal is that it rarely arrives looking dangerous at first. Most times, it arrives disguised as small changes you keep forgiving until the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. And by the time Amaka finally understood that something inside her marriage had started rotting, her husband had already built an entirely separate life overseas. The first real crack in the marriage appeared so quietly that Amaka almost missed it. It happened on a Thursday night during one of their usual video calls. Or at least, what used to be usual. By then, Chinedu had started avoiding video almost completely. Every excuse sounded reasonable on its own. Bad network, long shifts, headaches, overtime, stress. But that night, after nearly 3 weeks without seeing his face properly, Amaka refused to let the call end quickly again. "Turn the camera on," she said softly. There was a pause. Not long. Just long enough for something cold to move through her chest. Then he laughed awkwardly. "Aha, Amaka, why are you behaving like this? I told you I just came back from work." Then turn the camera on. Another silence. This time longer. When the screen finally lit up, the image lasted barely 2 seconds before disappearing again. But 2 seconds was enough. Amaka saw it immediately. A woman's handbag sitting behind him on the couch. Not just any handbag. A woman's handbag inside the apartment she had helped pay rent for. At first, Chinedu denied everything. "She's my colleague. She forgot it after work. You're overthinking." But the defensiveness in his voice felt wrong. Too sharp. Too prepared. And from that night onward, something changed between them permanently. The calls became colder. Less frequent. Sometimes he disappeared entire weekends without explanation. Other times he became strangely aggressive whenever she asked simple questions. Then came the money issues. The account they once used together suddenly stopped receiving his transfers. Bills he normally handled became difficult, unexpectedly. Meanwhile, his social media quietly transformed into something almost unrecognizable. Fewer photos. No live videos. No tagged locations. As if somebody was trying carefully not to be seen. Still, Amaka kept trying to save the marriage. Because people raised the way she was raised do not walk away easily from relationships. Especially marriages. Especially after years invested. She fasted. Prayed. Spoke to pastors. Ignored embarrassment. Ignored intuition. Ignored the growing feeling that every conversation with her husband sounded less like love and more like obligation. Then one Sunday morning, while preparing for church, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown Canadian number. At first, she almost ignored it. But something made her open it anyway. The message contained only 3 lines. "Your husband is lying to you. He lives with another woman in Toronto. Ask him why she calls herself Mrs. Okafor." Amaka read the message 4 times without breathing properly. Then she sat slowly on the edge of her bed while her church clothes remained folded beside her untouched. Because deep down, beneath the panic and confusion and disbelief, she already knew it was true. Not completely. Not fully. But in the dangerous way the body sometimes recognizes betrayal long before the mind is ready to accept it. And from that moment onward, the marriage stopped feeling wounded. It started feeling staged. Like she had unknowingly been acting inside a relationship that had already ended long ago for one of the people inside it. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while heavy rain hammered against the windows of Amaka's pharmacy office in Surulere. At first, she thought the email was spam. The subject line simply read, "Marriage dissolution documents." Nothing emotional. Nothing human. Just words that sounded administrative and cold. Her hands were already trembling before she opened the attachment. By the second page, she could barely see properly. Not because she was crying yet. Because her body had entered that strange state where shock arrives before emotion does. The kind where your chest feels hollow and your ears begin ringing softly while the world continues moving normally around you. Customers were still buying medication. Cars were still honking outside. Her co-workers were still laughing near the storage room. Meanwhile, 7 years of her life were collapsing silently inside a PDF document. Irreconcilable differences. That was the phrase written repeatedly across the forms, as though betrayal could be reduced to legal vocabulary, as though disappearing emotionally from a marriage for months while secretly building another family overseas was simply a difference. At the very bottom sat Chinedu's digital signature. Clean. Careful. Almost elegant. That was the moment the tears finally came. Not loudly. Not dramatically. She simply lowered her head onto the office desk and cried the way exhausted people cry when something inside them finally gives up fighting reality. But the worst part came later that night. Because heartbreak behaves differently after midnight. During the day, distractions protect you. Tonight, truth sits beside you in silence. Amaka lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above her while memories replayed themselves against her will. Their wedding dance. Airport goodbyes. Prayer calls. Voice notes. Future plans. Every memory suddenly felt contaminated. And once suspicion enters love, it rewrites the past brutally. Now she questioned everything. Had he ever really intended to bring her abroad? When exactly had the affair started? Did his friends know? Had people been laughing behind her back while she defended him publicly? By morning, she looked physically different. Not ruined. Just emptied. Her younger sister Chioma came over that afternoon carrying takeaway rice and forced optimism, but even she became quiet after seeing Amaka's face. "You should fight him," Chioma said eventually. Amaka gave a weak smile. "For what?" "For your marriage." The room went silent after that, because both women understood something painful at the exact same moment. You cannot fight for a marriage alone. Days passed strangely after that. Some relatives advised patience. Some blamed Canada. Some blamed modern women. Others blamed long distance. Everybody had an opinion except the one person who mattered. Chinedu himself barely called anymore. And when he finally did, his voice sounded irritated instead of guilty, as though her pain was inconveniencing him. "I'm trying to handle this peacefully," he told her during one tense phone call. Peacefully. Amaka almost laughed when she heard the word. Because there is nothing peaceful about slowly discovering you were loved honestly by someone who was lying strategically. Still, she signed nothing. Not yet. Not because she still believed the marriage could survive, but because somewhere beneath the heartbreak and humiliation and exhaustion, another feeling had quietly begun forming. Suspicion. And suspicion, once fully awake, rarely goes back to sleep. The embassy interview changed something inside Amaka permanently. Not immediately. Transformation rarely happens dramatically in real life. Most times, it begins quietly, like a door inside someone closing forever. After the interview, she sat alone inside a small cafe across the road from the embassy for nearly 2 hours without touching the cup of tea in front of her. Around her, people laughed, checked their phones, argued about traffic, discussed visa approvals and travel plans. Nobody noticed the woman sitting near the window slowly rebuilding her entire understanding of her marriage from scratch. Because now she finally understood something terrifying. Chinedu had not simply cheated, he had constructed 2 parallel lives, one in Nigeria, one in Canada. And somehow, he had balanced both long enough to make her question her own instincts instead of questioning him. But what disturbed her most was the embassy officer's final sentence before she left. "Mrs. Okafor, there are financial records connected to your husband's application that may also involve your identity." Financial records. That sentence followed her home like a shadow. That night, for the first time since the divorce papers arrived, Amaka stopped crying. Instead, she opened her laptop. Then she began searching. Old bank alerts, shared account records, tax emails, visa documents, property receipts, money transfer confirmations. First, the information looked harmless separately, but betrayal often hides inside patterns. And once Amaka started connecting those patterns together, the picture became horrifying. Large transfers she never authorized. Documents submitted using her married status. Joint financial claims connected to accounts she had never seen. Toronto address Chinedu never mentioned. Insurance forms listing another woman as emergency contact. BY 3:17 a.m. Amaka leaned back slowly in her chair and stared at the wall in complete silence. Because suddenly, the divorce papers made sense. This was never about love ending. This was damage control. Something overseas had gone wrong, and Chinedu was trying to erase her legally before authorities connected the contradictions in his records. That realization changed the nature of everything. Until that moment, Amaka had behaved like a heartbroken wife. Now, she started thinking like a witness. The old Amaka would have begged for explanations. The new Amaka became careful instead. Quiet. Observant. Dangerously patient. Over the next few weeks, people around her noticed the change without understanding it fully. She stopped discussing the marriage publicly. Stopped defending Chinedu. Stopped posting online. Stopped reacting emotionally whenever relatives brought him up. Even Chioma became unsettled by how calm she suddenly seemed. "You're scaring me small," her sister admitted one evening. Amaka looked up from the folder of printed documents spread across her dining table. "For the first time in months," she said quietly, "I think I finally understand what's happening." And what she understood was simple. If Chinedu was desperate enough to abandon 7 years of marriage through email, then whatever he was hiding abroad had to be far bigger than an affair. Much bigger. The question now was no longer whether he betrayed her. The question was, how far had the lies actually gone? And somewhere in Canada, without realizing it yet, Chinedu was already running out of time. 3 days later, Amaka returned to the embassy. This time, she was not there as a confused wife trying to understand her husband's betrayal. She arrived carrying documents, an organized folder, printed bank statements, marriage certificates, screenshots, transfer histories, emails, evidence. The embassy officer from the first interview recognized her immediately, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Amaka saw something shift in another person's face when they looked at her. Respect. Not pity. Not sympathy. Respect. Because calm people carrying evidence are far more dangerous than emotional people carrying anger. "Please sit down," the officer said carefully. And over the next hour, Amaka began laying everything out piece by piece. The timeline. The transfers. The contradictions. The sponsorship conversations. The divorce papers arriving immediately before her interview request. First, the officer listened quietly while taking notes. Then came the first real breakthrough. One specific transfer made 6 months earlier from Chinedu's Canadian account into a Nigerian business account under Amaka's name, an account she had never opened. The embassy officer frowned immediately. "Are you saying this business does not belong to you?" Amaka shook her head slowly. "No," the officer typed something quickly into her system. Then her expression changed. That same expression people get when a situation suddenly becomes much bigger than they originally thought. Because what Chinedu had done was no longer beginning to look like simple immigration dishonesty. It was beginning to look financial, potentially criminal. And somewhere between those records and false declarations and conflicting marital documents, the entire structure of his overseas life had started cracking open. That was when Amaka made a decision that surprised even herself. She stopped asking for her marriage back. Stopped hoping for explanations. Stopped wanting revenge in the emotional sense. Instead, she wanted clarity. Truth. Exposure. And if the truth destroyed Chinedu's carefully constructed life abroad, then so be it. Because people who build lies across borders often forget one thing. Systems do not get tired emotionally. Systems keep records. Over the following weeks, Amaka transformed completely. The old version of her had spent months crying quietly in bedrooms after midnight. The new version learned immigration procedures, learned financial reporting systems, learned how sponsorship fraud investigations worked, learned which agencies communicated internationally. Quietly, methodically, without drama. And the strangest part was this: as her marriage collapsed publicly. Her personal life began improving privately. Her pharmacy supervisor promoted her into administrative management after noticing how disciplined she had suddenly become under pressure. She started earning more money, sleeping better, thinking more clearly. For the first time in nearly a year, she stopped waiting beside her phone hoping Chinedu would suddenly become the man she remembered. That man no longer existed. Maybe he never truly had. Meanwhile, in Canada, Chinedu still believed he was controlling the narrative. He thought distance protected him. Thought silence protected him. Thought paperwork protected him. What he did not know yet was that every document he forged, every contradictory statement he submitted, every lie he told immigration authorities, was slowly being pulled together by the one person he underestimated most: his wife. And very soon, they were going to speak again. Not as husband and wife, but as two people standing on opposite sides of a collapsing story. The next time Amaka heard Chinedu's voice, it was almost midnight in Lagos. His call came unexpectedly. For a few seconds, she simply stared at the screen vibrating in her hand. Before, seeing his name used to fill her with relief. Now it filled her with curiosity. She answered calmly, "Hello." There was a long silence on the other side before he spoke, and immediately, Amaka understood something important. He was nervous. Not guilty. Nervous. The difference mattered. "Amaka," he began carefully, "I heard you went back to the embassy." Not, "How are you?" Not, "Can we fix this?" Straight to the embassy, straight to fear. Amaka leaned back slowly against her chair in the darkness of her apartment while rain tapped softly against the windows beside her. "Yes," she said. Another silence. Then his voice tightened slightly. "What exactly did you tell them?" There it was. Not heartbreak. Not concern. Damage control. For the first time since their marriage began collapsing, Amaka stopped hearing Chinedu as a husband. Now she heard him clearly as a man trying desperately to protect something. And suddenly, all the emotional confusion disappeared. Because once betrayal becomes visible, love starts sounding different. The manipulation becomes easier to hear. The rehearsed pauses become obvious. The selective honesty becomes unbearable. "I told them the truth." She replied quietly. "What truth?" "That I'm still legally married to you." The silence that followed lasted so long she checked the screen to make sure the call had not disconnected. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed completely. Harder. Colder. "You don't understand how immigration works here." Amaka almost smiled hearing that sentence. Because people begin explaining systems aggressively only when they are afraid those systems are turning against them. "Then explain it to me," she said calmly. Another pause. But this time, she could hear movement behind him. A door shutting somewhere in the background. Footsteps. Then quieter breathing, like somebody had moved into another room for privacy. That tiny detail told her more than words could. He wasn't alone. And somehow, instead of hurting her, the realization made her feel strangely powerful. Because while Chinedu was still hiding pieces of his life carefully overseas, Amaka already knew enough to destroy the illusion completely. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." He finally said. "No," she answered softly. "You made it harder when you used my name while building another marriage." The line went dead silent. Then came the first crack. "How much do you know?" Not denial. Not anger. Fear. Real fear. Amaka closed her eyes briefly. Because in that exact moment, she realized something that changed the balance between them permanently. Chinedu no longer saw her as weak. He no longer saw her as the quiet wife waiting helplessly in Nigeria while he controlled everything abroad. For the first time since this nightmare began, he saw her as dangerous, and that terrified him. What Chinedu still did not understand yet was that the investigation had already moved beyond marital problems. Immigration officers had started requesting financial verification records. Questions were being asked about sponsorship inconsistencies. Addresses were being cross-checked. Documents compared. Quietly. Systematically. And every new question tightened the pressure around the life he had spent years constructing overseas, a life built so carefully on deception that even one honest person refusing to stay silent could bring the entire thing down. Amaka listened to him breathing softly. Through the phone. Then she asked the question he feared most. "Who is the woman using my surname in Canada?" For several seconds, Chinedu said nothing at all. And in stories like this, silence usually tells the truth. 3 weeks later, the first crack appeared publicly. Not online. Not dramatically. Quietly. The kind of quiet disaster that begins inside official emails before it reaches real life. Chinedu was at work in Toronto when his supervisor called him into a private office and asked why immigration authorities had requested updated verification on his residency documentation. First, he remained calm. People who live double lives become skilled at remaining calm, he answered carefully. Smiled carefully. Explained carefully. But panic had already started spreading underneath. Because once institutions begin rechecking documents, it means somebody somewhere has noticed a contradiction. And contradictions are dangerous when your entire life depends on paperwork remaining unquestioned. Meanwhile in Lagos, Amaka continued living almost normally. That was the part nobody expected. She still went to work every morning. Still visited her mother on Sundays. Still bought fruit from the same woman near the junction beside her apartment. But inside her dining room every night, folders kept growing. More records. More timelines. More evidence. And with every new discovery, the scale of Chinedu's deception became clearer. The second woman was not random. Her name was Vanessa, a Nigerian permanent resident he met 2 years earlier through mutual friends in Toronto. According to the records immigration officers quietly reviewed, Vanessa had introduced herself publicly as Mrs. Okafor for nearly a year. There were shared utility bills, joint rental agreements, photographs, insurance documents. Even worse, Chinedu had allegedly claimed his marriage in Nigeria was already informally separated, while still filing documents connected to Amaka's sponsorship process at the same time. 2 Marriages. 2 Stories. 1 Legal identity. And somewhere inside those contradictions sat potential fraud. The pressure started affecting him quickly. His calls became more frequent now, but different. Less confident. More desperate. Sometimes he spoke gently, trying to sound emotional again. Other times he became angry suddenly. Why are you doing this to me? Amaka almost laughed the first time he asked that question. Because people who betray others often become shocked when consequences arrive looking unfamiliar. You did this yourself, she replied calmly. But the true collapse began 2 Fridays later. That morning, Vanessa discovered the truth. Nobody knows exactly how. Some said immigration contacted her directly. Others believed she found messages between Chinedu and a lawyer. One version claimed she saw Amaka's marriage certificate during a document review. Whatever happened, the result was immediate. Vanessa moved out of the apartment that same weekend. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, Chinedu found himself completely alone, and no wife in Nigeria, no stable relationship in Canada, no emotional control over the narrative anymore. Just investigations. Questions. Paper trails. Consequences. Then came the financial review. The undeclared business transfers connected to Amaka's identity triggered additional scrutiny. More accounts were examined. More inconsistencies surfaced. And slowly, the polished immigrant success story Chinedu had spent years presenting abroad started collapsing under the weight of its own dishonesty. Amaka heard most of this indirectly through embassy updates and scattered conversations. But the moment she truly understood how serious things had become happened late one evening when Chinedu called her again unexpectedly. This time, he was crying. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just exhausted. I might lose everything, he admitted quietly. Amaka stood near her kitchen window, staring out into the Lagos traffic below while his voice trembled softly through the speaker. And for a moment, she remembered the version of him she once loved. The young man under the umbrella in Enugu. The husband who used to pray with her at midnight. The man who promised her a future abroad. But memory is dangerous when mixed with betrayal. Because sometimes the people we miss most never truly existed the way we remember them. You should have thought about that before. Building 2 lives, she said softly. And after she ended the call, Amaka realized something unexpected. She was no longer angry. She was free. The final collapse happened 6 months after the embassy interview. Ironically, it happened on the exact day Amaka received her own international job offer. But why then? Life had changed so completely that some mornings she woke up briefly forgetting she had once begged herself not to cry before work because of Chinedu. Pain fades strangely when people stop feeding it daily. The pharmacy company she worked for had expanded operations into the United Kingdom, and after months of additional training and administrative work, Amaka was offered a relocation position in Manchester. Real one, not promises. Not future plans hanging on somebody else's honesty. Her own opportunity. Built by her own hands. The email arrived at 9:14 a.m. She read it twice quietly inside her office before covering her mouth with one hand and laughing softly to herself for the first time in months, not because life had become perfect, but because for the first time since her marriage collapsed, her future belonged fully to her again. Then, less than 2 hours later, her phone rang. Chinedu. Amaka stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. His voice sounded completely different now. Smaller somehow, like someone speaking from inside ruins. They denied my renewal. He said immediately, no greeting, no pride left. Just devastation. Amaka closed her office door slowly. Outside, co-workers continued moving through the hallway unaware that somewhere across the Atlantic, a man's carefully constructed life was finally collapsing completely. What happened? She asked quietly. Chinedu laughed once. But it did not sound like humor. They said there were too many inconsistencies. He paused. They're investigating everything now. Everything. The accounts. The declarations. The sponsorship contradictions. The second marriage. The financial transfers. The false timelines. All of it. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Then Chinedu said something that surprised her. I thought being far away meant I could control everything. There was no arrogance left in his voice now. Only exhaustion. And regret. Real regret. But regret arriving after consequences is a very different thing from honesty arriving before exposure. Amaka walked slowly toward the office window and looked down at the Lagos traffic moving below her. People buying food. Danfo buses swerving aggressively. Street vendors shouting. Life continuing. And suddenly she understood something important. This story was never truly about Canada. Or immigration or even infidelity. It was about power. Chinedu believed distance gave him power. Money gave him power. Silence gave him power. He believed the woman waiting back home would always remain dependent on his decisions. What he never imagined was that the same woman he dismissed quietly would become the person capable of unraveling everything. You know the worst part? Chinedu asked softly. Amaka said nothing. The worst part is that you were actually the only person who ever truly loved me. The sentence landed heavily between them, because it was true, and both of them knew it. But some truths arrived too late to save anything. For the first time since this nightmare began, Amaka did not feel anger hearing his voice. She felt distance. Emotional distance. The kind that appears when grief finally finishes transforming into acceptance. I have to go, she said gently. Amaka. But she ended the call before he could finish. Then she stood silently inside her office holding her new relocation letter while sunlight spilled across the desk in front of her. Months earlier, she thought divorce papers had ended her life. Now she understood they had only ended an illusion. And somewhere in Toronto, the man who once believed he was untouchable sat alone inside the ruins of the double life he built himself. Amaka left Nigeria 9 months later on a cold Thursday evening while her mother cried quietly into the edge of her wrapper at the airport. Not dramatic crying. The restrained kind mothers use when they are trying to remain strong for their daughters. Chioma hugged her 3 separate times before finally stepping back and saying, See, you thought your life had ended. Amaka smiled softly but said nothing. Because surviving betrayal changes the way people speak about pain. You stop making big declarations after learning how quickly life can rearrange itself. She sat beside the airplane window waiting for takeoff. Her phone buzzed one final time. Message from Chinedu. Not a long message. Not an emotional speech. Just one sentence. I'm sorry for everything. Amaka stared at the words for several seconds. Months earlier, she would have cried reading that message. Months earlier, she might have stayed awake all night searching for hidden meaning inside it. But healing changes the emotional weight of things. Now it simply felt late. Quietly, she locked her phone screen and placed it face down beside her. Outside the aircraft window, Lagos glowed beneath the night sky in scattered orange lights while airport workers moved across the runway below like shadows. Crossing water. And for the first time in years, Amaka felt no need to look backward. Because somewhere between the divorce papers, the embassy interview, the investigations, the humiliation, and the long nights rebuilding herself quietly, she had become someone entirely different. Not harder. Just clearer. She understood now that betrayal does not destroy people the way they fear it will. Sometimes it exposes the parts of their lives that were already built on illusion. Chinedu lost almost everything. In the months that followed, his residency status became uncertain. His relationship collapsed publicly. His financial records remained under investigation. Friends disappeared slowly once the truth spread. But the thing he lost most was something no immigration officer could document officially. Trust. The trust of the one person who had believed in him completely before success, before relocation, before ambition transformed into deception. And years later, whenever Amaka thought about that embassy interview, she no longer remembered the shock first. She remembered the question. "Ma'am, are you aware your husband has already remarried in Canada?" Because sometimes a single question is enough to expose an entire hidden life. And sometimes the people sent to break you accidentally force you to become the strongest version of yourself instead. In the end, Chinedu lost the one thing he valued too late to protect, the woman who loved him honestly before the world taught him how to lie. And it all started the moment he underestimated the quiet wife waiting for him back home. If you've ever had to rebuild your life after discovering someone you trusted was living a completely different truth behind your back, drop your city in the comments. And tell me, at what moment did you finally realize the person you loved was no longer the person you thought they were?
Please support this community by subscribing to this channel. Thank you very much.